Hi, I'm Sylvie from HR.com, and I'll be your webcast host today. I hope everyone's enjoying today's virtual event so far. Welcome to What Employers Need to Know About Pay Equity and How to Be Proactive, sponsored by Trusaic. I'm pleased to introduce you to our presenters, Joanna Kim-Brunetti and Mark Dwyer. Joanna Kim-Brunetti is a former partner with Aiken Group, Strauss Hauer and Feld LLP. She has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. She brings additional regulatory compliance experience from her pre-legal career in consulting and the aerospace industry. Joanna holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Loyola Law School with honors. She was president of the Korean American Bar Association, Rising Star Super Lawyers, co-chair of various subcommittees under the American Bar Association and the Los Angeles County Bar Association. Mark Dwyer was formerly a senior economic consultant for the Harris Economics Group, where he provided written and oral expert testimony regarding the interpretation of empirical analysis. He directed data cleaning and the construction of empirical models, among other responsibilities. Mark also worked as a senior economist for Econ One Research, Inc., and taught econometrics as an assistant professor at UCLA. Mark has a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Rochester, an MA in finance from the Wharton School, and a BA in physics from University of Pennsylvania. He has been affiliated with the American Economic Association, the Econometric Society, and the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. This webcast has been pre-approved for 1 HRCI business credit and 1 SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A tab of your webinar controls and type them in there. And it's now my pleasure to turn you over to today's presenters.
Thank you. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So let me give you a roadmap of what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to talk about the current trends in U.S. pay equity laws, basically the mapping of U.S. policy, looking at some EU nations and their laws to see how these may affect the trends for the U.S. law, how all these trends will impact your organizations, what exactly is a pay equity audit, and also very important survey that was conducted between Harvard Business Review Analytics and our company Trusaic to see sort of what the concerns are in connection with pay equity and the importance of pay equity. Okay, next slide. So current trends in U.S. pay equity laws, and they're in sort of 5 main categories. I'll be discussing with you the safe harbors under state law, the important expansion of the definition of part of the pay equity laws, and specifically what comparable work means, the restriction on affirmative defenses available to employers, the increasing trend for pay data reporting, and how state and local jurisdictions continue to take action driving the pay equity need. Okay, next slide. Okay, so with regard to equal pay safe harbors, the point of this is to really encourage employers to conduct pay equity audits. Various jurisdictions have created these safe harbors, and it's, the way they've incentivized is to limit the damages available to a plaintiff in a pay discrimination lawsuit for those who have actually conducted a pay equity audit in a particular time frame. So what kind of pay equity audit are we talking about? We're talking about is employers have to demonstrate good faith in conducting the audit. In other words, it's not just numbers made up. It's an actual meaningful statistical analysis to show whether or not there is, a pay gap between the protected group and the reference group, i.e., for example, gender, between men and women. And in conducting that audit, there's no requirement that there is no disparity. It's just that an actual audit was conducted. And then the second element is that there has to be reasonable progress towards remedying whatever disparities are uncovered through the pay audit. These have been enacted in Massachusetts, Oregon, Colorado, and there's differences, which I'll get into. Next slide. So in Oregon, the benefit of conducting this pay equity audit is that employers can avoid potential emotional distress and punitive damages if that reasonable progress is made. Now, punitive damages can be a big deal in discrimination lawsuits, so pay discrimination lawsuits. So this is a big value for employers. In Massachusetts, it acts as a complete defense, even better. For those employers who have conducted this good faith, reasonable self-evaluation, this pay equity audit, and demonstrate reasonable progress towards eliminating it. Again, the key is not that you've actually achieved pay equity, but that you're making progress. In Colorado, it's what we call safe harbor light, because what it really gives you is an ability to, as an employer, to avoid liquidated damages if you conduct a quote-unquote thorough and comprehensive pay audit. And each one of these have certain time frames of when these audits have to be conducted, and there's variation into reasonable and substantial progress, reasonable progress, thorough and progressive, comprehensive pay audit. They have meanings in different jurisdictions, but the concept is the same. And I note that these 3 states, these all happened fairly recently, and this is part of that trend where there is a trend to encourage employers to conduct pay equity audits by providing these safe harbors. Next slide. Now, under the Federal Equal Pay Act, which has been around for 50 plus years, in a nutshell, it basically says equal pay has to be paid to men and women for the same jobs. That's in a nutshell. Now, what states are doing are passing legislation that expands what the sort of equal job is, and instead of equal, we're talking about comparable or substantially similar. And so it expands those who can be compared. As a generality, in a discrimination lawsuit, the more people you can lump together to show a disparity, the easier it is to show the disparity. The smaller the group, the easier it is to show that you can't compare Susie and Mark because Susie is a facilities custodian and Mark is a outside custodian. Whereas, those 2 custodial jobs may be comparable, and in the more expanded scope, you would want to lump them together. So, examples of these increasingly expansive scope of comparable work are California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and Oregon. Next slide. Another area that we're seeing trends is limiting the affirmative defenses available to employers. Now, under the Equal Pay Act, this is a federal act, there's sort of 4 prongs for gender pay disparities. There's the seniority system, the merit system, some type of system that measures by quality or quantity of production, and this 4th factor, which is a differential based on any other factor other than sex or gender. And this is this 4th category is increasingly being limited. States are increasingly limiting this factor. State laws that are similar to the federal law, instead of this sort of generic a differential based on any factor other than sex. They've expanded that narrowed it, where those factors have to be bona fide. For example, the factors have to be job-related and consistent with business necessity, not just any factor other than sex. It has to be job-related. And these states include California, Colorado, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Washington, Vermont. And I put the dates next to each of those states there. And as you can see, these are all very recent. So this is the trend where more states are narrowing what this fourth factor can be. Now, there was this federal law that was similar to these states to limit this bona fide factor. However, even though it had been introduced multiple times within the last 10 years, so far it hasn't passed. But depending on where we are in Congress, it may be reinitiated. But this is the trend, and that's the point I'm trying to make with these years being listed for each state. Next slide. Now, another area is the trend towards pay data reporting. Now, New Jersey, for example, they required public contractors to submit an equal pay report to the government. And it's not limited to gender, it's also by race, exempt status, and ethnicity. Now, additionally, the EEOC, under the former administration, had imposed this component to data reporting, and that is, the EEO1 report. That's the general, basically, survey of all the employees and what race, ethnicity, gender, etc. Are of all the workers. But this expanded it to include the pay data for those workers, and that went into effect for the 2017. Starting in 2017, and then with the new administration, that was pulled back, but through some litigation, that ended up being reinstated. And so employers with 100 employees or more, had to submit pay data. This was last fall when that deadline was, that had the component to that pay data. Now, there was a California Senate bill that came out last year that would have required sort of similar pay data reporting. It didn't pass, but the trend is that there are states and jurisdictions moving towards that. And I'm going to talk about the UK and the other EU members' laws that really are a harbinger of what may be coming down the pike in the U.S. Okay, next slide. Now, an additional consideration in terms of trends is states and localities are continuing to take related action. And for example, over the last few years, many jurisdictions have been prohibiting employers from inquiring about a candidate's earning history and relying on that history to set future pay, the sort of salary bands. There's 17 states and Puerto Rico that have enacted it, and a number of cities have also enacted salary history bans. And related to this are wage transparency laws, which prohibit retaliation against employees who discuss pay with others. In California, requires an employer, this is a recent law, requires an employer upon a reasonable request to provide a pay scale for a position that an applicant is applying for employment. So there's all this sort of state and localities action that's happening that's really kind of dovetailing into pay equity. All of these things are designed to encourage pay equity. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned, so the EU nations are driving more a bigger push towards equal pay. Next slide. Now, in the UK, they enacted the UK Equality Act of 2010 that required all employers with 250 more employees to publish pay-related data. And this only took effect just a couple of years ago. That means that in that pay data reporting, employers had to provide the mean and median gender pay gap, proportions of men and women receiving a bonus, proportions of men and women in each quartile pay band. And this data is publicly available and searchable. And some people call this, basically it's a shame statute. It's to, basically publicly expose employers who have pay inequity, basically to socially shame them into having pay equity, or if they have reached it, it's a bragging point. And so, the question is whether or not this is a trend and this is impacting the U.S. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the EEOC for the 2017 and 2018 years, they have required pay data reporting. So that pay data reporting is out there, at least in the EEOC database, which is potentially accessible by a plaintiff who sues their former employer. It's still in flux whether or not that reporting requirement will resume. And New Jersey, they began pay data reporting requirements for public contractors. That was just within the last 2 years. So these things are, it's still early in the pay for pay data reporting to be universal, but what this is indicating is that there's a trend towards that, and oftentimes legislatures will look at what other legislators are doing, including outside the U.S., to see if this is something that they want to adopt for their own jurisdiction. Next slide. So France, similarly, and this again, you can notice the dates. This is all recent. France, starting in 2019, required organizations to publish pay data. So by next month, organizations that are as small as 50 or more employees must assess their compensation structure using an evaluation method that equates points with progress towards reducing the gender gap. So these point indices have to be public facing, so publishing basically pay data, and if you don't do that, you're subject to a penalty of up to 1% of the total payroll, so not a trivial amount. And as I mentioned, this started in 2019, so it was for much larger organizations, those with at least 1,000 employees. That started March 1 of last year. Organizations between 250 and 1,000 were required to publish by last September, and now it's gone down to organizations as little as 50 employees. Next slide. Spain, again, very recent, passed in March 2019. Employers with 50 or more employees must develop and publicly release workplace quality plans. A requirement of the plans is that companies conduct a pay equity audit in consultation with the employees' legal representatives, for example, like the union. So, a nuance to this sort of pay equity audit is you got to conduct the audit, and you got to do it in consultation with the employees' representatives. So the employer and the employee have to cooperate in conducting the pay audit. So this is a stricter framework. And the companies must also prepare reports to their employees showing average pay levels disaggregated by gender and other protective factors. Next slide. So, we've talked about a number of state and local jurisdictions as well as UK jurisdictions that have been increasingly, incentivizing either by carrot or stick to conduct the pay equity audit. Next slide. So what this is doing is it's increasing the urgency to scrutinize your compensation decisions and conduct a pay equity audit. So I talked about this comparable work, like instead of just equal pay for equal work, we're talking about equal pay for comparable work. Again, broadening the potential pool of employees that can be compared. And so that's increasing the risk of liability for pay discrimination for employers. Certain states like California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and Oregon, employers cannot avail themselves to just any factor other than sex to justify a pay disparity. So, for example, these people who have this job title slightly different than the job somebody else's job title. That's the difference. Well, is that really a bona fide factor that's job related? and not basically arbitrary. States, as I've mentioned, are increasingly limiting this bona fide factor other than sex. It has to be tied to the job and of business necessity. The additional nuance is that, with the salary history bans, basically the prohibition of salary history bans. In other words, allowing employees to talk about their salaries, job applicants, allowing them to, employers preventing them from asking about how much they're getting paid. All of these things are just really moving towards trying to achieve pay equity. And also, just in addition to sort of liability risk, that what you're doing is these sort of pay equity protections are designed to create bad PR if you are not achieving pay equity. Okay, next slide. Now, as I mentioned, I think we're still in the sort of nascent stage of pay data reporting, but it's becoming, it is a trend, albeit the early part of the trend. Major corporations are distinguishing themselves as pay equity leaders by publicizing pay data as part of their focus on winning the war for talent. So, for example, Intel made its pay data public as part of its EEO-1 Component 2 reporting. Starbucks and Citigroup also released data on their median pay. And I was talking about this EEOC reporting. This reporting is there. This is for all employers with at least 100 employees. They were required to submit for the 2017 and 2018 years. Now that, of course, is in flux for subsequent years, but it's there. The EEOC has it, and if a former employee or current employee wants to assert pay discrimination, files a charge with the EEOC and/or file suit, they could potentially get that data. That data is there, and the question is, do you know what that data means? Okay, next slide. Now, talking about sort of bad PR, the vast majority of employers are not engaging in intentional discrimination. It's unintentional discrimination that we're talking about. It's not enough to say, well, gee, I don't, none of my hiring managers or promoting managers, none of them are actually engaging in discrimination intentionally. It doesn't matter. Discrimination is discrimination. It's what the results show. What does your pay data show? Does your pay data show a pay disparity or not? That's what pay equity has focused on. Next slide. So, we talked about this EEOC reporting and the data that the EEOC has, this raw data, that will reveal a pay disparity or not, but it's not going to consider any legitimate business factors as to sort of basically reduce that apparent pay gap. So this is where the pay equity audit really comes into place. For all the reasons, the encouragement for employers to get certain safe harbors by conducting it, basically to know whether or not there's a pay disparity. And this is why you need to do the pay equity audit. Next slide. What is it? What is a pay equity audit? It is an analysis of your workforce that identifies the pay disparities, which could potentially result in liability, as well as the statistical weight of legitimate business factors, i.e. things like tenure, job tenure in the position, tenure in the company, et cetera, that contribute to the pay gap. And importantly, a pay gap, a pay equity audit can be protected as privilege. And among the important roles that a PEA or pay equity audit does is that identifies and quantifies the risk within your organization. And this quantification helps defend against claims of discrimination, and it helps you monitor which factors are driving the wage gaps in your company over time. Next slide. So if you know the metrics of the pay disparity and you consider all the legitimate factors to basically legitimize some of those pay gaps. Sometimes there could be a perfectly good reason for it, but doing the pay equity audit will allow you to take that into consideration. And there are certainly plenty of good reasons to do it. If you do the pay equity audit and you really don't have a pay disparity, it's an avenue for you to tout that and distinguish yourself as a equal pay reporter, employer. Obviously, that would increase retention, recruiting, and employee engagement. And from a sort of nuts and bolts standpoint, it's going to give you the metrics that executives are going to need to affect change in the company. Next slide. Okay, so here are just the basic steps of the pay equity audit. One is you want to determine whether or not you want to establish, the sort of the privacy and confidentiality protocols and the privilege protocols for the audit. Second, you want to establish the scope of the analysis, and basically what workforce or which employees in the workforce, which groupings are going to be considered over what time frame, etc. You can identify what legitimate business factors apply. They don't necessarily all apply. So my example of the custodian, perhaps whether or not the person has a college degree, which may be a perfectly good factor in another position, might not have any application for the custodian position. Preparing the data sets, and that's going to, I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but, getting all the data together to do the analysis, determine which groups which employees get grouped together. And once you've done that, then you can perform the statistical modeling to create, to generate the metrics you need to figure out whether there is a pay disparity or not. And then when you're looking at the pay disparities, if they're the really outliers, whether there's actually additional legitimate reasons for those disparities. And once you've figured out the numbers, it will help you. It will give you the tool you need to determine a remediation strategy and implement. And because employers are always hiring new employees, employees are always leaving, over time, people are getting promoted, et cetera. It's not a stagnant situation. It's not just one snapshot. It is a fluid situation, so it needs to be monitored and tracked in terms of progress. Next slide. Okay, and as I mentioned about this getting the data sets together, clean data is really important. I mean, the old adage of garbage in, garbage out is totally applicable here. The data, if the data has errors in it, it's incomplete or outdated or whatever, that data is being used to run the metrics. If the data comes in that is all wrong, the results are not reliable. So it's very important to make sure that data is clean. Next slide. Okay, so I want to launch the first poll question. It's now that you've heard this explanation of what a pay equity audit, has your organization conducted a regression-based pay equity audit in the past 2 years? Okay, Sylvie, if you can let folks know how much more time they have to conduct the audit. I'm sorry, to answer the poll question.
Okay, we've got about half of the audience has voted, so let's get some more votes in. We'll leave it up for another 15 seconds or so. And I'm going to end the poll and launch the results. Okay, now what I see is it's kind of all over the map in terms of the results. 21% said they did conduct one in the last 2 years. 36% said they didn't. 28% said we've done some analysis but not a pay equity audit, and 15% said I don't know. I think the key takeaway is that 79%
did not affirmatively say they conducted one. And I think that's really important. And this is something that you and the members of your organization should really consider whether or not that pay equity audit should be done. Our view is it should. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so my colleague, Mark Dwyer, is going to take over on the very important HBR Trusaic survey.
Thanks, Joanna. So we're turning now to the pay equity survey that Trusaic sponsored and conducted with Harvard Business Review Analytics Services. This survey provides insights regarding where pay audits are and are not being conducted and the reasons for those decisions, as well as perceptions of where pay differences exist and what underlies those pay differences, or what the perceptions of those underlying differences are. Next slide. Okay, so the first aspect of the survey is the extent to which companies are conducting pay equity audits. And we saw in our own survey that we were at about 21% confirming that they had in fact done a statistical assessment of whether they have a pay discrimination issue or not. So next slide, please. Okay. Before we get to that issue, we're just breaking down the survey that was conducted into its demographic components here. We've got the majority of respondents were from the U.S. and about 12% from the U.K., which gives us a nice contrast. 80% of the respondents are from firms with at least 1,000 employees, and half of respondents are from global or multinational firms. The respondents are roughly balanced between genders. Two-thirds of the respondents are executives and senior management. Most are not in human resources. The sample's roughly balanced across 5 industries, but a sixth across 5 industries it's roughly balanced, as you can see. But a sixth industry, the healthcare and pharmaceuticals, is represented about twice as often as the other 5. A greater share of UK respondents. Next slide, please. Now we get to the responses here. So we see here that in the HBR survey, there was a high affirmation of having conducted a pay equity audit. The share is higher, about 85% in the UK versus 75% in the US, and that ties back to the stringent reporting requirements that Joanna mentioned a moment ago in the UK. While these shares are high, they are probably broader and include more pay comparisons than our poll did, because in the survey we didn't ask the specific question about whether they used statistical controls and gathered statistical evidence to defend against claims of pay discrimination. So this may have a broader sense of a pay equity comparison. Next slide. Okay. In terms of asking executives in the survey, with their three-fourths of executives in the survey indicated that they were evaluating internal pay equity. So again, that's a strong number, and we do have some that are not considering it, but overall it seems to be on the agenda across most of our respondents for the HBR survey. Next slide. Okay. So here we're asking about what drives companies to conduct pay equity audits. Next slide. And the first question is about external factors. What are the external drivers that push firms to conduct pay equity audits? 3 of these responses are reporting requirements, risk mitigation, and proposed legislation are pretty strongly tied to this issue of wage discrimination. Those are all fairly focused on the issue of wage discrimination. But none of those, taken together, they are the dominant response. But if we look at them individually, they are overshadowed by concerns regarding hiring and retention. And while this primary focus, with over 50% citing hiring and retention, it likely reflects the importance that employees place on pay fairness. It also raises the question as to whether some respondents are confusing pay equity audits internally comparing pay with benchmarking to pay surveys and other means to make sure that offerings are competitive with the marketplace. Let's see here. Reporting requirements, such as those required by federal, state, federal contractors, and some states are proposing now too, edge out litigation risk for the number 2 driver on pay equity audits. Social media, in terms of recruitment websites, offers a comparable motivation to that coming from litigation risk. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of the external drivers that firms are responding to and that you may be feeling pressure from as well. Next slide. Okay, this is looking at it from a UK versus US perspective. In the UK, where reporting regulations make pay gaps more transparent, pay audits are motivated less by the competition for talent than explanations of those reporting pay gaps. So we see that, pardon me, here, we see that here where pay reporting requirements are driving pay equity audits in the UK much more strongly than they are in the US. Even though the UK firms have to publish their pay gaps, those published pay gaps do not seem to raise litigation risk. Instead, the litigation risk is a stronger driver in the US than it is in the UK. The UK, at least, in the UK at least, simple pay transparency regulations, as Joanna described earlier, seem to substitute for litigation risk as a driver of pay equity audits. It seems to have sort of a comparable effect in driving that interest in that. Okay, I think we have another poll question. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, yes, the next poll question is, what has or would motivate your organization to undertake a pay equity audit? And here we have the same factors that we saw in the HBR survey to sort of compare our own participants to that survey. All right, and remember what we saw there was that labor market competition, hiring and retention was a dominant factor there. It'll be interesting to see what we find among our participants today.
Okay, once again, I'm going to give it another 15 seconds or so everybody get your votes in there. And I'm going to close the poll and share the results.
All right, there it is. Okay, so here, this is really interesting that labor market competitors competing for talent is getting about half the weight that we saw in the HBR survey. Pay reporting requirements are coming in about 10% less than they were in HBR as well. Managing litigation risk is about the same point in the high 20s here. Proposed legislation is roughly comparable too, and then we have some that don't know as well. So we're seeing here that relatively speaking, we're getting within our participants right here, there's a stronger emphasis on the issues of wage discrimination and the potential risks that might pose. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we talked about what were some of these external drivers of pay equity audits. The next question is, what prevents companies from conducting pay equity audits? So let me just get to that slide on my own slide here. Okay. Right. So next slide, please. Right. So these are the top barriers, and many of these are mirror images of the things that we saw that were drivers. So in certain jurisdictions, there'll be stronger regulation, and in certain markets than in others. And so when there's an absence of that regulation, that's one of the top reasons why companies are not conducting pay equity audits or not considering it. A second set of barriers. So along those, in addition to regulation, there's also the issue about whether the hiring and retention pressure is present or not. Some firms in the HBR survey said that they did not feel that as a priority to address it with pay equity. The second set of barriers focuses on not having available resources and data to perform the pay equity audit. So we see here that the cost of diverting resources is in the high 20s, and the lack of recorded data is also over 20% of respondents are saying that they don't know if they have the data, or the data is costly to assemble in order to conduct a pay equity audit. The last point that also gets about the same weight, and it's worth dwelling on for a few minutes, is this concern about how the data would be used or how the results of the audit would be used. And that sort of brings us to the next question, which is if we, one of confidentiality or attorney-client privilege, and how important that is in terms of conducting a pay equity audit. Is the counsel involved in that decision? Are they the ones driving that decision? And are you conducting that in a privileged context? That brings us to our next slide, another poll question. How much is attorney-client privilege valued when overseeing pay equity audits? So for those of you who are considering or have conducted pay equity audits, what role does attorney-client privilege play in your organization in protecting that analysis? Because we saw among the HBR participants that a significant proportion of them are concerned that information, that report that they may have done may uncover issues that they don't want to have disclosed. And by keeping that under the within a privileged framework, that's protected. But it's hard, I think, to communicate that message to employers that they have that as an option, as long as they adhere to the privilege protocols.
Okay, give it another few seconds here.
And also ties into the context as to how transparent an employer is being with their compensation across employees and how much they're able to share that information up front as well.
And now I'm sharing results.
Okay, and that's what we've seen in the marketplace as well, is that it is highly valued, that it is a pretty strong priority we've got 58% saying highly valued and almost 20% saying that it's somewhat valued. And then others, it's a question that is a little off for those who have not conducted a pay equity audit. But even if you haven't conducted one, it's worth considering, if you're considering conducting a pay equity audit, that privilege framework is worthwhile getting in place from the start. Okay. So we go to the next slide, please. All right. Further barriers to pay equity audits. So, as we saw a moment ago, resource considerations are a barrier to conducting pay equity audits in terms of getting the data together, and in addition to drawing statistical and legal expertise, accurate pay audits typically require significant investment in producing the quality data. Particularly important is ensuring that the factors that determine compensation are correctly and completely represented in the data. If you don't have the right factors, if they're not available, that went into compensation decisions, then it's pretty hard to explain pay differences with them if those factors are absent. Data wrangling in particular is often overlooked, and among those big companies that have conducted their own pay equity audits, that's where the great bulk of their time has gone. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So this next question provides a couple of reasons why data wrangling costs are often more substantial than firms realize. First, less than 1 in 5 respondents indicate that the data on employee and job characteristics, which are fundamentals of pay equity audits, were in the same data warehouse. This illustrates and emphasizes how data preparation costs can be underestimated when firms make decisions regarding pay equity audits. Okay, next slide. All right. Most organizations have incomplete pay equity data. So this is the second feature, is that even the first one is that data is residing in different areas and has to be merged together and made to work together. The second is that fewer than half of the respondents indicate that their data on job and employee characteristics are complete. I realize the legend is incomplete as well. The dark bars are representing respondents who said their data on that topic was complete. So a dark blue bar means that the employee benefit, that's the high percentage of respondents were saying that their employee benefit data is complete. But when we get down to employee characteristics and job characteristics, the proportion they're saying is complete is much, much lower, below 50%. These data, employee and job characteristics, are typically necessary for a pay equity audit. Okay, so now next slide, please. Right. So now this is our next polling question. How confident are you in the accuracy of your organization's employee data? And specifically here, we're referring to those benefits are pretty well nailed down often, but it's this issue about the employee characteristics such as education, experience, and other factors that go into evaluating employees, and even performance reviews. How systematized are those? Are those something that you have at the ready that you can incorporate into a quantitative statistical analysis, or are they softer and more spread about, and so harder to is there going to be some cost in terms of turning that into hard data? So think about those considerations when you answer this poll question. Those features of positions and features of employees in those positions and their performance, how well tracked are those? And are those easily accessible for conducting an analysis? Got a few more seconds here.
Okay, I'll give it another 15 seconds or so.
Great. And also, I mean, here I think there might be a lot of respondents that may say they don't know, and that's worth flagging as well, because you have to think about things in different perspectives and bring together disparate types of information for a pay equity audit that isn't usually used in the normal course of business in one place and one time. Okay, so we have here that about a quarter, a little bit more, 20% feel that they have very accurate data across those different dimensions. Others, a large proportion, 43%, say are somewhat confident in the accuracy of that information. Then we have 15 and another 17% either lack confidence in it or don't know. So, we have the majority feel that they have at least some confidence in the accuracy of that data. But again, we're less than a third, which is sort of consistent with what we saw in the HBR survey, is that overall the confidence in those diverse sources of information being consistent and accurate is not strong. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so right here, before moving on with the survey, I just wanted to touch on some misconceptions that are also inhibiting pay equity audits. The first is waiting for regulation. Waiting to be forced by regulation to conduct a pay equity audit is a bad strategy for several reasons, and to name just two. First, a firm may be already behind recent legislation and not know it. As Joanna surveyed, the regulatory and legislative ground is rapidly evolving. Diverse legislative pressures at the federal, state, and local levels have created an overlapping mosaic of shifting regulations and litigation risks. Moreover, a business presence in multiple jurisdictions requires significant work just to know in what areas of the organization may be vulnerable. So, am I allowed to take into account prior salary or not? Okay, how does that vary across the areas in which I work in? Just to name one. So second, all firms are operating in increasingly diverse environments, both in terms of talent and in terms of your customer bases and in terms of sources of investment. Examining pay equity improves the firm's ability to successfully engage with these diverse operating environments and these constituencies. You're diversifying labor force, diversifying investors, and diversifying customers. This is reflected in many sources that discuss the value of diversity. One is a recent study by the World Economic Forum that you can look up on the web that talks about the business case for embracing diversity is overwhelming. Regarding external benchmarking, the second point, that often these two are conflated and they're really distinct issues. Internal pay equity, we really should make an effort in terms of using the word internal in talking about pay equity audits. External benchmarking market rates can perpetuate disparities, for example, through pay differences in comparable positions that reside in historically gender-separated departments, or through historical evaluation of male-dominated traits that don't have that underlying business justification that Joanna laid out in terms of comparable work that she spoke about earlier. that another perception that we sort of touched on in this last poll was whether the data is readily available. The majority of respondents, participants here and in the HBR survey said that those pieces are not readily available, they're incomplete, and we have some difficulty in putting them together. A final point is one that's sort of a complement to what Joanna was talking about, just validating her point that when we move to these comparable work standards, that we are broadening the set of employees that are comparable, that can be compared and would be compared in a discrimination action. And so the notion that a firm or employer has a very diverse workforce in terms of their functionality, so that the numbers are very small in any given function, that really is something that requires a lot of defense to support, and even some statistical evidence would be helpful in that regard. So it's unlikely to be as strong a separation as many employers may assume. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, pay disparities. This is now shifting to perceptions from our survey respondents as to where discrimination or pay differences are most prominent. Next slide, please. Okay, so most common areas here, maybe not surprisingly, survey participants are most focused on gender pay differences, with differences in race, ethnicity, and with age receiving about equal priority behind gender. Over a fifth of respondents consider themselves to be prohibited by their employers from comparing compensation with coworkers. Joanna's mentioned that there are legislative efforts to roll that back, that in many jurisdictions, employees will have greater rights to discuss their compensation with their coworkers. But this may have depressed response rates in the survey regarding perceived pay differences because many respondents were simply not able to gather that information among their peers. Next slide. Okay, the sources of pay disparities. So here we, next slide, please. Okay, so here there are 6 factors. These are the top 6 factors that are cited for why we have differences in pay. Salary history is one that is the dominant, the highest response. Then negotiating ability is the second highest response. 57% say salary history. Again, that received the most responses. And that can reflect the perception that employees are on unchangeable trajectories from the first day with the firm. So they came in at a high rate and they've been in that trajectory ever since then. 42% of the respondents also identified discrimination in advancement, or otherwise known as glass ceilings, as an underlying cause of pay differences. And that's worth noting. Pay rate discrimination was an explicit survey potential response there, which is really getting at, are we just being discriminated in terms of a wage? Okay, so advancement discrimination is different from pay discrimination, and that's an important distinction to make in a pay equity audit. The pay equity audit is primarily focused on pay discrimination, okay, discrimination in compensation, other things being equal. What it can reveal, which we'll talk about in a moment, is that there may be an issue with advancement discrimination, with how people are promoted, retained, hired, and so on. But it's not going to give you definitive evidence of that. It's just going to give you some hint to further examine those areas. Okay. So it's at 35%, yeah, that's the least ambiguous response. We also saw in our respondents that job-related abilities and job performance were also cited. So the respondents do see legitimate business factors as drivers of pay differences. Next slide. Okay. I'm going to have to sort of speed up here. But the point here is that the dark lines are no pay equity audits, and if we look at this last horizontal here, discrimination in pay rates, that shows a dramatic fall when companies have conducted pay equity audits. Okay, the perception that there are actual pay discrimination in the organization, that falls substantially when pay equity audit is conducted. Next slide. Okay, leading change. Next slide. This is just making the point that HR and senior management seem to have to be engaged, and that's kind of an obvious point, but both of those constituencies need to be on board when conducting a pay equity audit, and those are the most important ones in our survey. Next slide. Okay, how do you accurately measure the pay gap? Again, we're sort of running short on time, but knowing the difference between a gap, which is just an average difference, and a disparity, which controls for bona fide factors, that's an important takeaway. Investing in data and consolidation is important. That's going to be a big part of your efforts. Constructing and validating pay groups is important, and testing for potentially tainted factors. Next slide. Okay, again, this is going into a bit more of the weeds on this, if there's a balance in statistical analysis between precision and robustness. But I think we'll have to move on from this because we're running short on time. Next slide, please. Okay, what options does an organization have in responding to identified pay disparities? I'll just hit the highlights here. Depends on your organizational culture. All options have to be vetted with legal counsel, obviously. The nature of the disparity, whether additional investment in data might resolve the disparity, and then budget and time frame. Finding a disparity isn't something that has to be addressed potentially. It may not have to be addressed depending on these other factors overnight. An incremental approach could be taken. Next slide. Okay. Can you maintain existing compensation and incentive frameworks while resolving pay disparities? Essentially, pay disparities are showing you deviations from the factors that you've identified as being drivers of pay differences. So what is an indication is that the framework has to be adhered to more strongly. Gaps will not be resolved, though. Gaps are driven by underlying differences between men and women in characteristics that are being quantified business factor characteristics that are driving those overall wage differences. And those are not a liability. Okay, next, at least a pay discrimination liability. Next slide. So in summarizing, pay equity audits identify liabilities in pay. Okay, that's what they're meant to do. And while many say that they're conducting a form of pay comparison, they often lack the statistical evidence. They're not generating the statistical evidence to support the foundations that they think they have in place. There's increasing diversity of regulations and laws that need to be adhered to. Fear of regulation can be countered with the privilege, with attorney-client privilege, and that should be embraced. Perceptions of pay disparities are most apparent in gender, followed by age and ethnicity, race and ethnicity. Okay, next slide. Okay, thank you. And then I think we have, I think we're out of time, but if we get questions, we may be able to answer them offline. But thank you for your time.
Thank you.
On behalf of HR.com, I would really like to thank our sponsor, Trusaic, and our great presenters today for informing our audience. It's a lot of information, and we have provided the slides so that you can download the slides. And as was mentioned there, if there are any questions, then our presenters will reach out to you privately later. You will be receiving an email with your credit information. You'll also find your credits on your View My Credits page of your membership profile once the webcast has been archived. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. And this concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.